In a drought-stricken village where hope had all but vanished, a broken-down workhorse destined for slaughter becomes an unlikely savior, transforming not just one person's life, but the destiny of an entire community. This is the extraordinary tale of how faith, determination, and the spirit of one cast-aside animal brought life back to a dying town and proved that sometimes the most powerful miracles come from the most unexpected places. The dust seemed to settle on everything in Millbrook Valley these days. Once a thriving farming community, nestled between rolling hills and ancient oak trees, the village now wore the weight of 3 years of relentless drought like a heavy shroud. The creek that had once been the lifeblood of the community had dwindled to little more than a trickle, and the once fertile fields lay cracked and barren under the merciless sun. Sarah Chen stood at the edge of her family's property, watching. The evening light cast long shadows across the parched earth. At 28, she carried herself with the weathered dignity of someone who had faced more than their fair share of hardship. Her grandfather's farm, passed down through 3 generations, had once been the pride of Millbrook Valley. Now, like everything else in the village, it was struggling to survive. The old wooden barn, its red paint peeling and faded, stood as a testament to better days. Inside, the stalls that had once housed a dozen strong workhorses now stood empty, save for 2 aging mares, the last remnants of their once impressive herd. Sarah could still remember the sound of hooves on wooden floors, the sweet smell of hay, and the gentle nickering that used to greet her every morning. But those memories felt like echoes from another life now. Most of the younger people had already left Millbrook Valley, seeking opportunities in the cities where water still flowed freely and jobs didn't depend on the whims of weather. But Sarah couldn't bring herself to abandon the land that had shaped her, even as she watched it slowly wither away. Her grandfather's words, spoken on his deathbed just 6 months ago, still rang in her ears. The land remembers those who remember it. The Sai village itself was a shadow of its former self. The main street, once bustling with farmers' markets and community gatherings, now saw only the occasional pickup truck stirring up dust as it passed through. The general store, run by old Mr. Thompson, stayed open more out of stubbornness than profit. The school had closed last year when the number of students dropped below 10, and the church bell rang on Sundays for a congregation that grew smaller with each passing month. But it wasn't just the drought that had brought Millbrook Valley to its knees. It was the loss of something more fundamental, the spirit of community that had once made this place special. Sarah could see it in the slumped shoulders of the remaining farmers, in the worried lines etched deep in their faces, in the way they avoided each other's eyes at the weekly town meetings where they discussed water rations and falling crop prices. Sarah's own family farm had been innovative once. Her grandfather had been known throughout the county for his forward-thinking approach to agriculture and his prize-winning horses. The Chen family's workhorses had been legendary in these parts, strong, intelligent animals that could work tirelessly in the fields and seemed to understand their handlers' needs almost before they were expressed. Those horses had helped build Millbrook Valley, plowing fields, hauling loads, and even helping to construct the town hall that still stood at the center of the village. But now, as Sarah walked along the fence line checking for repairs she couldn't afford to make, she felt the weight of that legacy pressing down on her shoulders. The farm's last major source of income, breeding and training workhorses, had dried up along with everything else. Nobody wanted to invest in horses when they could barely afford to feed their families. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed to mock the barren landscape below. Sarah paused at the old water pump, its handle worn smooth by generations of hands. It still worked, though the water table had dropped so low that it took nearly 50 pumps to get anything more than a trickle. As she worked the handle, her muscles protesting the familiar motion, she could hear the murmur of voices from the road, another family loading up their truck, another set of goodbye waves, another piece of Millbrook Valley's heart driving away into the gathering darkness. But something caught her attention, a conversation floating on the evening breeze. Two of the older farmers, discussing the upcoming livestock auction in the neighboring county. They mentioned that several farms were selling off their remaining horses, unable to justify keeping them fed through another winter of uncertainty. Sarah's hands stilled on the pump handle, her mind already turning over possibilities she knew were foolish. The farm couldn't afford another mouth to feed, especially not a horse. Yet as she stood there in the growing darkness, surrounded by the ghostly shapes of empty paddocks and silent fields, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time. A spark of an idea, dangerous and wild as a summer lightning storm. Perhaps, she thought, sometimes the most desperate times called for the most desperate measures. Perhaps what Millbrook Valley needed wasn't just rain, it needed something to believe in again. Little did Sarah know, as she walked back to the farmhouse that evening, that her impulsive decision to attend that auction would set in motion a chain of events that would change not just her life, but the fate of every soul in Millbrook Valley. Sometimes hope comes in the most unexpected packages, and sometimes salvation arrives on four legs, bearing the scars of its own hard journey. The Chen family farm hadn't always been just about horses. Sarah's grandfather, Li Wei Chen, had arrived. In Millbrook Valley 60 years ago, with nothing but a few dollars in his pocket and an unwavering belief in the power of hard work. Through sheer determination and an almost supernatural understanding of horses, he had transformed a plot of dusty land into one of the most respected farms in the county. Sarah sat at the old kitchen table, its surface scarred by decades of family, meals and late-night discussions, poring over the farm's ledgers. The numbers stared back at her, each red entry a reminder of how far they had fallen. The morning light filtering through the window illuminated the collection of faded ribbons and photographs that lined the walls, testaments to her grandfather's legacy. In one particularly prominent photo, Li Wei stood proudly beside Thunder, Spirit, the stallion that had put the Chen farm on the map. The horse had been nothing special when her grandfather found him, a scrawny yearling with a bad attitude and worse conformation. But Li Wei had seen something in those defiant eyes, a spark of potential that nobody else had noticed. Under his patient guidance, Thunder Spirit had become legendary in the valley, siring a line of workhorses known for their intelligence, strength, and unwavering loyalty. A horse isn't just muscle and bone, Li Wei used to say, his accent thickening with emotion. A horse is heart, spirit, history. When you look at a horse, you must see not just what it is, but what it could become. Sarah could still hear his voice, still feel the roughness of his weathered hands as he guided hers in learning the proper way to handle a lead rope, how to read a horse's body language, how to earn trust rather than demand obedience. The kitchen. Radio droned quietly in the background, announcing another day of record-breaking temperatures and empty promises of rain. Sarah pushed away from the table, her chair scraping against the worn floorboards. The auction was tomorrow, and she knew she should be focusing on the farm's immediate needs, fixing the irrigation system, patching the barn roof, paying the mounting pile of bills that threatened to overwhelm them. Instead, she found herself walking to the small office that had been her grandfather's sanctuary. The room still smelled of leather and pipe tobacco, though Li Wei had been gone for months now. His old desk dominated the space, its surface covered with notebooks, filled with his careful observations about every horse that had ever passed through. Their gaits. Sarah ran her fingers along the spines of these makeshift journals, each one a testament to her grandfather's dedication to understanding the animals he loved. The last entry in the final notebook was dated just days before his death. The handwriting was shaky but still legible. Remember, little sparrow, his nickname for her. A farm is more than land and buildings. It's a promise we make to the past and the future. Sometimes keeping that promise means taking risks that others don't understand. Sarah sank into her grandfather's old chair, the leather creaking in familiar welcome. The drought had hit them hard, yes, but it wasn't just the lack of rain that was killing Millbrook Valley. It was the loss of purpose, of identity. The town had been built on the partnership between humans and horses, on the understanding that together they could accomplish what neither could do alone. The local paper lay open on the desk, folded to show the auction announcement. Sarah had read it so many times she had memorized every word. 50 horses were to be sold, many from farms that had been in families for generations. The thought of these noble animals being sold off, perhaps to slaughterhouses or unscrupulous buyers, made her stomach turn. Her mother's voice drifted in from the kitchen, talking on the phone with their last remaining farmhand about cutting back his hours again. The conversation was heavy with unspoken worry. They could barely afford to keep the 2 old mares they had, let alone take on another horse. Common sense said to stay away from the auction, to focus on survival, to accept that the age of working horses in Millbrook Valley was over. But as Sarah sat in her grandfather's chair, surrounded by the evidence of his life's work, she felt something stirring in her heart. The same stubborn determination that had driven Leeway to build something from nothing. The same fierce belief in the power of second chances and the value of taking risks that others deemed foolish. The auction. Catalogue lay unopened on the desk. Sarah picked it up, her fingers trembling slightly. Inside were listings for horses of all ages and breeds. Former show horses, retired race horses, working animals no longer needed in an increasingly mechanized world. Each one represented a story, a possibility, a chance to honor her grandfather's legacy in a way that went beyond simply surviving. Sometimes, Leeway had told her once, the most valuable things are the ones that others have thrown away. He had built their farm's reputation on his ability to see potential where others saw only problems, to transform cast-offs into champions through patience, understanding, and unwavering faith. Tomorrow, Sarah would go to the auction. She didn't have much money, barely enough to bid on even the cheapest horse. But she had something else. Something her grandfather had taught her was far more valuable. The ability to see beyond surface appearances, to recognize the spark of greatness in the most unlikely places. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to start turning the tide not just for her family's farm, but for all of Millbrook Valley. The county livestock auction was a far cry from the prestigious horse sales Sarah remembered attending with her grandfather in better days. The makeshift corrals behind the old fairgrounds were overcrowded with animals, the air thick with dust and desperation. Horses of all breeds and conditions stood shoulder to shoulder, many bearing the obvious signs of neglect that came with hard times. Sarah arrived early, her grandfather's old truck rattling into the parking lot as the sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon. She carried only 2 things: the envelope containing every last dollar she could scrape together, barely enough for even the most basic bid, and her grandfather's final notebook, its pages dog-eared and well-worn. Something about having his words close to her made her feel less alone in this venture that everyone else would surely see as foolish. The morning air was already hot, promising another scorching day. As Sarah made her way through the gathering crowd, she could hear snippets of conversation that made her heart heavy. Meat buyers were out in force, their discussions coldly practical about price per pound and transportation costs. These weren't horse people. They were businessmen looking to profit from others' misfortune. Then she saw him. In the furthest corner of the last corral, partially hidden in the shadows, stood the largest horse Sarah had ever seen. He was a draft horse, probably a Percheron cross, standing well over 18 hands high. His black coat, though dull and matted, couldn't hide the powerful muscling beneath. But it was his eyes that caught and held Sarah's attention. Deep, intelligent eyes that seemed to hold centuries of wisdom and sorrow. "That one's not worth your time, miss," a gruff voice said behind her. Sarah turned to find one of the auction workers, clipboard in hand. "Been through 3 owners in the past year. They say he won't work, just stands there like a statue, no matter what you do. He's headed for the meat buyer today. At least he'll bring a good price by the pound." Sarah approached the corral slowly, her heart pounding. The huge horse watched her come, neither welcoming nor rejecting her presence. Up close, she could see the scars that marked his broad chest and shoulders, signs of a working life, but also of something else. There was a pattern to them that spoke of systematic abuse, of someone trying to force submission through pain. "What's his name?" Sarah asked, not taking her eyes off the horse. "Atlas," the worker replied, checking his clipboard. "Though if you ask me, they should have called him Waste of Space. He's got the power to pull a mountain, but he won't pull a thing. Just plants those big feet and stands there like he's made of stone. Atlas. In Greek mythology, Atlas was the Titan condemned to hold up the sky for eternity." Looking at this magnificent animal, Sarah could see both the strength for such a burden and the weight of carrying it. Without thinking, she opened her grandfather's notebook to a blank page and began to do what he had taught her: observe, analyze, understand. The horse's stance wasn't stubborn as the worker suggested. It was protective. He held himself in a way that guarded his right shoulder, suggesting an old injury that had never properly healed. His neck muscles were overdeveloped on one side, hinting at years of compensating for pain. But beyond the physical signs there was something in his demeanor that spoke to Sarah's soul. Atlas wasn't broken. He was waiting. Waiting for someone to see him, to understand that his refusal to work wasn't defiance, but self-preservation. In his steady gaze, Sarah saw a reflection of Millbrook Valley itself, something magnificent brought low by circumstance, but not yet, ready to surrender its dignity. The auction was starting, and buyers were moving toward the main arena. Sarah heard the worker mutter something about the meat buyer's truck being ready at the back gate. Time was running out. She looked down at the envelope in her hand, knowing the money inside wasn't even close to what a horse this size would bring for meat. Then she looked back at Atlas, and in that moment, she heard her grandfather's voice as clearly as if he stood beside her. "Sometimes the most valuable things are the ones others have thrown away." With trembling fingers, Sarah pulled out her bidding card. The worker was already shaking his head, probably thinking she was another soft-hearted fool who didn't understand the harsh realities of their times. But Sarah wasn't acting on emotion. She was acting on something deeper, something her grandfather had instilled in her through years of working with horses others had given up on. In Atlas's eyes, she saw not just a horse in need of saving, but a key to something larger. In a town dying of thirst, sometimes what you need most isn't water. It's hope. And standing there in the dusty morning light, Sarah Chen made a decision that would either prove to be the final nail in her farm's coffin, or the first step toward saving not just a horse, but an entire community. Little did she know, as she walked toward the auction arena with her head held high, that Atlas wasn't just a horse who had given up on working. He was a horse who had been waiting for the right kind of work, the right kind of purpose, and most importantly, the right person to help him find it again. The drive back to Millbrook Valley was the longest 30 miles of Sarah's life. Every bump in the road made the ancient horse trailer creak ominously, and every rattle sent a spike of anxiety through her chest. In the trailer behind her, Atlas stood quietly, too quietly. The massive black horse hadn't made a sound since loading, which had been surprisingly easy given his reputation. He had simply followed her up the ramp, as if he'd been waiting for her all along. News traveled fast in farming communities. By the time Sarah pulled into the Chen family farm, a small crowd had gathered. Her mother, May, stood at the front, arms crossed and face set in an expression that Sarah knew all too well, the look of someone trying to hold back a flood of worried words. Behind her, several of the remaining local farmers had assembled, their weathered faces a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "They say you bought Joe Miller's problem horse," old Pete Wilson called out as Sarah parked the truck. "The one that nearly killed his youngest boy last spring." His voice carried no judgment, just the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating what everyone was thinking. Sarah took a deep breath before stepping out of the truck. The auction had taken every penny she had, and then some. She'd had to borrow from Mr. Thompson at the general store to cover the final bid. The meat buyer had been furious, publicly declaring her a fool for paying more than slaughter price for a horse that wouldn't work. But standing here now, Sarah forced herself to project a confidence she didn't entirely feel. "I bought a horse. That needed a chance," she replied, moving toward the trailer. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as she lowered the ramp. Inside, Atlas's massive form shifted slightly, his shadow filling the trailer's interior. The crowd murmured as he emerged, and Sarah couldn't blame them. Even covered in dust and sweat from the journey, he was an impressive sight. Mei Chen stepped forward, her experienced eye taking in every detail of the huge horse. "Salah," she said softly, using Sarah's Chinese name. "What have you done?" The worry in her voice was tempered with something else, a hint of her late husband's appreciation for magnificent horses, no matter their circumstances. Atlas stood perfectly still on the gravel driveway, his head held high but not proud, his eyes taking in the gathered crowd with what Sarah was beginning to recognize as his characteristic quiet assessment. He seemed neither afraid nor aggressive, simply present, watchful, waiting. "He's got an old injury," Sarah explained, pointing out the slight unevenness in his stance. Here and here, someone tried to force him to work through pain instead of letting it heal. She opened her grandfather's notebook, showing the observations she'd made at the auction. "But look at his bone structure, his muscle development. He's not just big, he's built for endurance." Old Pete stepped closer, his lifetime of horse experience evident in the way he moved carefully around Atlas's blind spots. "Chen," he said, using Sarah's grandfather's name as he always had. "He used to say there's no such thing as a lazy horse, just ones whose purpose we haven't found yet." He ran a gnarled hand along Atlas's shoulder, feeling the muscles beneath the dull coat. "Question is, what purpose does a horse this size serve in a valley that can barely grow enough to feed itself?" It was the question Sarah had been asking herself all the way home. In the past, draft horses like Atlas had been the backbone of farming communities like Millbrook Valley. But with modern machinery and 3 years of drought, what could one horse, even one as magnificent as Atlas, really do to change things? The answer came from an unexpected source. Tommy Thompson, the general store owner's 10-year-old grandson, had squeezed through the crowd to stand before Atlas. The boy had been born with a leg condition that left him dependent on crutches, but it hadn't dampened his curiosity about the world. "He looks like the horses in Grandpa's old pictures," Tommy said, pointing to Atlas. "The ones that used to pull water from the deep wells before they had electric pumps." The boy's innocent observation sent a ripple through the crowd. Sarah saw several of the older farmers exchange thoughtful looks. The deep wells. Before the drought, before modern irrigation systems, Millbrook Valley had been dotted with deep wells that tapped into underground aquifers. Most had been abandoned when electric pumps became common, then sealed up completely when the water table dropped too low for standard pumping systems to reach. But if they could be reopened, if they could find a way to reach the deeper water. Sarah looked at Atlas with new eyes. Draft horses like him had once been used for exactly this purpose, their incredible strength allowing them to draw water from depths that would burn out mechanical pumps. But would he work? Could this horse, who had refused to move for 3 previous owners, be the key to accessing the water Millbrook Valley so desperately needed? The crowd began to disperse, some shaking their heads at what they clearly saw as another Chen family folly, others lingering to study Atlas with speculative eyes. Mei touched Sarah's arm gently. "Your father used to say that hope is like water in the desert. A little bit can keep you alive, but too much can make you chase mirages." Sarah watched as Atlas lowered his head to sniff at the parched earth, his movements deliberate and careful. "Sometimes," she replied, "you have to risk chasing a mirage to find an oasis." But as she led the massive horse toward the barn, she couldn't help wondering if she had just sacrificed her family's last resources, on an impossible dream. The first week with Atlas tested every bit of knowledge Sarah had inherited from her grandfather. The massive horse settled into the largest stall in the barn, but that was about the only thing that went smoothly. He accepted food and water calmly enough, but the moment Sarah tried to initiate any kind of work, even something as simple as walking with a lead rope, he would plant his feet and become as immovable as the mountains that rimmed the valley. It wasn't defiance exactly. There was no anger in his stance, no threat in his demeanor. He simply refused. Sarah spent hours watching him, making notes in her grandfather's journal, trying to understand. Atlas moved freely enough in his stall and the small paddock she'd cleared for him. He showed no signs of pain when walking or turning. But the moment any kind of equipment came out, halter, harness, even a simple lead rope, he would retreat into that statue-like stillness. Water finds its own level, Leeway had written in one of his earliest journals. And horses find their own truth. Our job is not to force them into our path, but to understand the path they're already on. Sarah read those words over and over, sitting on an overturned bucket outside Atlas's stall in the pre-dawn hours, watching the giant horse's steady breathing. The town's skepticism was palpable. Every day someone would stop by, ostensibly to check on the Chen farm, but really to see the useless horse that Sarah had spent their last resources on. Old Pete Wilson was one of the few who offered genuine help, sharing stories of the deep wells his grandfather had worked with draft horses back in the valley's early days. It wasn't just strength they needed, he explained one evening, watching Sarah try unsuccessfully to get Atlas to accept a harness. Those horses had to understand rhythm, the steady pull, the timing of rest and effort. It was like a dance between horse and handler, each trusting the other to maintain the balance. Sarah thought about this as she watched Atlas move around, his paddock in the evening light. His movements, though careful, had a natural grace to them. He never wasted energy, never made unnecessary motions. Even the way he drank from his water trough was measured, deliberate. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Tommy Thompson had taken to visiting after school, sitting by the paddock fence with his crutches laid beside him, talking to Atlas in his clear, bright voice. The horse seemed to enjoy the boy's company, often standing near him as Tommy read aloud from his school books. One blazing afternoon, Sarah watched in amazement as Atlas gently picked up one of Tommy's crutches that had fallen through the fence rails, carefully maneuvering it with his lips until he could return it to the boy's reach. The action was so deliberate, so carefully thought out, that Sarah felt her understanding of Atlas shift completely. This wasn't a horse that wouldn't work. This was a horse that needed to understand the purpose of every action, needed to feel that his efforts were meaningful. The previous owners had tried to force him into blind obedience, but Atlas, like the titan he was named for, needed to know why he was being asked to carry the weight. Sarah began to change her approach. Instead of trying to impose a training routine, she started including Atlas in the daily rhythms of the farm. She would talk to him as she worked, explaining what she was doing and why. When checking the old well sites with old Pete, she would lead Atlas to them, letting him observe as they cleared debris and took measurements. The horse's intelligence became more apparent daily. He watched everything with those knowing eyes, taking in details that Sarah herself sometimes missed. When she struggled with a heavy feed bag, she found him positioning himself so she could rest it against his shoulder. When she surveyed the old well equipment, he would study the mechanisms with an almost human intensity. May, who had been quietly skeptical of the whole endeavor, began to notice changes too. "He reminds me of your grandfather," she said one morning, watching Atlas delicately pick his way around a broken fence post that needed fixing. Always thinking, always watching, never moving without purpose. Slowly, the atmosphere around the farm began to shift. Atlas's presence, far from being a burden, seemed to bring a new energy to the place. His methodical nature, his quiet strength, started to affect everyone who spent time around him. Sarah found herself adapting to his rhythms, learning to slow down and think through problems instead of rushing to solutions. The old well near the barn became their testing ground. Sarah would bring Atlas there each morning, talking through her plans to restore it, showing him the old equipment they'd salvaged. At first, he would simply stand and watch, but gradually he began to show interest, reaching out to nose the ancient mechanisms, positioning himself near the wellhead as if trying to understand its purpose. It was during one of these sessions that Sarah noticed something extraordinary. As she struggled to shift a rusted pulley into position, Atlas not only moved to help, but actively engaged with the equipment, using his nose and shoulder to stabilize it exactly where it needed to be. The action was so precise, so purposeful, that Sarah found herself fighting back tears. This was what her grandfather had always taught her to look for. Not just obedience, but understanding. Atlas wasn't just strong enough to help access the deep wells. He was smart enough to be a true partner in the work. The question was, could Sarah find a way to build on this understanding before the valley's last hopes dried up completely? The say. Summer heat had reached its peak when the first real crisis hit. Sarah had been making steady progress with Atlas, building trust through their daily routines around the well. But on this particular morning, everything changed. The day started. Normally enough, Sarah arrived at the barn at dawn, ready to begin their usual work. But the moment she opened the barn doors, she knew something was wrong. Atlas stood rigid in his stall, his massive body trembling. His eyes, usually so calm and knowing, were wide with a fear Sarah had never seen in him before. When she approached, he backed away, pressing himself against the rear wall with such force that the sturdy wooden planks creaked in protest. Something must have spooked him during the night, old Pete suggested when Sarah called him for help. But as they investigated, a more troubling picture emerged. The night had brought the first real thunderstorm in months, a violent squall that had torn through the valley with shocking intensity. The lightning had hit Old Man Jenkins' abandoned barn about a mile away, and the resulting fire had filled the air with smoke and the acrid smell of burning wood. For most horses, a thunderstorm might cause anxiety, but Atlas's reaction went beyond normal fear. This was deep-seated trauma, triggered by something specific about the night's events. Sarah found herself thinking about the scars on his chest and shoulders, wondering what horrors in his past could have left such deep emotional wounds. "There's a story here," May said softly, watching Atlas's continued distress. "In China, they say that some memories are carried in the bones." She shared a look with Sarah that spoke volumes. They both knew that recovery wasn't just about physical healing. It was about confronting the ghosts of the past. The next few days were a nightmare. Atlas refused to leave his stall, wouldn't even approach the door. The progress they'd made at the well came to a complete halt. Worse, word spread quickly through the valley about the dangerous draft horse at the Chen farm. Several neighbors stopped by to suggest, with varying degrees of gentleness, that perhaps it was time to admit defeat. "Nobody would blame you," Mr. Thompson said kindly, after extending her credit at the store for another month. "Sometimes an investment just doesn't pay off." The sympathy in his voice almost broke Sarah's resolve. She knew what everyone was thinking, that this setback proved them right about Atlas being worthless, about her decision being foolish. But late that night, unable to sleep, Sarah found herself reading through her grandfather's oldest journals. In one, dated decades ago, she found an entry that made her breath catch. "The greatest challenge in healing a horse isn't fixing their body. It's helping them trust again after humans have betrayed that trust. They must learn that not all pain leads to more pain, that not all darkness lasts forever." The next morning, Sarah did something different. Instead of trying to coax Atlas out, she simply pulled up a stool and sat in his stall with him. In the quiet dawn light, she began to talk, not about what she needed from him, but about her own fears. She told him about the weight of her grandfather's legacy, about the nights she lay awake wondering if she was foolish to stay in the valley when So many others had left. "I'm scared too," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "Scared of failing, of letting everyone down. Scared that staying here means watching everything my family built turn to dust." Atlas's trembling had stilled as she spoke. His ears, which had been pinned back for days, slowly swiveled toward her voice. Throughout that day, Sarah remained in the stall, reading aloud from her grandfather's journals, sharing stories of other horses he had helped, other seemingly impossible challenges he had faced. As the hours passed, Atlas gradually relaxed. By evening, he had moved close enough to rest his massive head near her shoulder, his breath warm and steady against her arm. It was Tommy who provided the final piece of the puzzle. The boy arrived the next day with an old newspaper he'd found in his grandfather's store. The article, yellowed with age, detailed a tragic fire at a logging camp 5 years ago, a fire that had killed several horses and one handler. Among the surviving horses was a young Percheron cross, sold at auction soon after. The dates matched Atlas's known history. "He's not afraid of work," Sarah realized, watching Atlas watch her from his stall. "He's afraid of being trapped, of being helpless while everything burns around him." The revelation hit her hard, making her think about her own fears of being trapped in a dying valley, helpless to prevent its slow decline. That evening, Sarah made a decision. She removed everything from Atlas's stall, every rope, every piece of equipment that might remind him of being restrained. Then she opened both the stall door and the barn door, giving him a clear path to freedom. If he wanted to leave, to escape, what he feared, she would let him choose. Instead, Atlas stayed. Not because he was confined, but because he chose to trust. As the sun set, casting long shadows through the barn doors, Sarah saw something change in his eyes. The fear was still there, but it no longer controlled him. Like the valley itself, he had been shaped by hardship, but not defeated by it. "We're not so different, you and I," Sarah told him softly. "Maybe we're both a little broken, a little scared. But maybe that's what makes us strong enough to help each other heal." As if in response, Atlas lowered his head to her shoulder, and together they watched the last light fade from the sky, two souls finding courage in each other's presence. The discovery came on a Tuesday morning, as unexpected as rain from a clear sky. Sarah had been cleaning out the old storage shed behind the barn, searching for any salvageable well equipment, when she found a locked metal box tucked behind decades of accumulated farm tools. The key, she discovered, was hanging on her grandfather's old key ring, marked with Chinese characters she couldn't read. Inside the box lay a collection of maps, drawings, and journals she'd never seen before. These weren't her grandfather's usual training notes. They were detailed surveys of Millbrook Valley's underground water system, compiled by the original settlers and updated through generations. The yellowed pages showed something extraordinary, a network of natural underground rivers and aquifers that ran deep beneath the valley's surface. "Your grandfather and I spent years updating these," old Pete said, when Sarah showed him the documents. His weathered hands traced the faded lines. With reverence, the deep wells weren't just random holes in the ground, they were carefully placed to tap into this network. But when the electric pumps came in, everyone thought the old knowledge wasn't needed anymore. The maps revealed something crucial. The current drought hadn't dried up the valley's water. It had just dropped the water table below the reach of modern pumps. The deep wells, with their horse-drawn systems, had once reached far deeper than any electric pump could manage. And more importantly, they had done it without depleting the aquifers, working in harmony with the natural water flow. Sarah spread the maps across the barn's wooden floor, Atlas watching intently over the stall door. The horse's ears pricked forward as she traced the lines with her finger, his intelligent eyes following her movements. The main well on their property, according to the maps, sat at a crucial junction of underground waterways. If they could reopen it, they might be able to access not just water for their farm, but enough to help the entire valley. but the technical drawings of the old pumping system gave Sarah pause. It wasn't just about raw strength. The horse-drawn pumps had worked on a complex system of counterweights and mechanical advantage. The horse needed to understand timing, needed to maintain a steady rhythm while responding to subtle changes in the water flow. That's why the electric pumps failed, old Pete explained, pointing to a notation in the margins. They couldn't adjust to the natural fluctuations in the aquifer, but a good horse could feel it, could sense when to ease off and when to pull. Harder. He looked at Atlas thoughtfully. Your grandfather used to say that the best well horses were the ones that thought before they pulled. As if understanding he was being discussed, Atlas nickered softly. Since the night of the storm and their breakthrough, he had shown an increasing interest in their work around the well. Now, watching him study the maps with almost human concentration, Sarah felt a surge of hope. Atlas wasn't just strong enough. For this work, he was smart enough to understand it. May found them still studying the maps at dusk. She took one look at the documents and sat down heavily on a hay bale. "Aya," she breathed. "I remember these. Your grandfather showed them to me when we were first married. He said they were his most valuable possession, more precious than gold in a dry land." The Chinese characters in the margins, she explained, were notes about the relationship between the wells and the lunar cycles, observations about how the underground water moved with the phases of the moon. It was knowledge that blended science with ancient wisdom, understanding gained through generations of working with the land rather than trying to dominate it. But Sarah, May cautioned, these systems haven't been used in decades. The wells are all sealed, the equipment rusted or lost. Even if Atlas can do the work, how can we possibly restore something so complex? The answer came from an unexpected quarter. Tommy Thompson, who had been quietly listening from his usual spot near Atlas's stall, spoke up. "My grandfather's store. Basement is full of old farm equipment. He never throws anything away. Says everything might be useful again someday." Sarah looked at the maps, then at Atlas, then at the people gathered in the barn, each of them representing a different piece of the puzzle. The horse's strength and intelligence, old Pete's experience, May's understanding of the Chinese annotations, Tommy's access to old equipment through his grandfather's store. Perhaps the real discovery wasn't just the maps themselves, but the reminder that no one person was meant to solve problems alone. The old well systems worked because they were about cooperation, she said slowly, realization dawning. Not just between horse and handler, but between neighbors, between generations, between human knowledge and natural wisdom. Atlas made a soft sound of agreement, and Sarah saw her own understanding reflected in his eyes. They weren't just trying to find water, they were trying to rebuild the connections that had once made Millbrook Valley strong. The transformation of the Chen farm began before dawn the next morning. Word had spread quickly through what remained of the community. The maps had been found, the old knowledge rediscovered. People started arriving as the sun rose, carrying tools, equipment, and stories passed down from their grandparents about the deep wells that had once sustained the valley. Thompson's store basement proved to be a treasure trove. Buried under decades of dust were crucial pieces of the old well mechanisms, pulleys designed specifically for horse-drawn operation, counterweights calibrated to the underground water pressure, and hand-forged metalworks that had been built to last generations. Each piece they recovered was like finding another piece of a forgotten puzzle. "My father used to talk about these," said Mike Henderson, the town's mechanic, as he examined a particularly complex set of gears. Said they were designed to work with the horse's natural rhythm, not against it. The whole system was built on understanding, not just force. He looked up at Atlas, who stood watching the proceedings with keen interest. "Guess that's why your big fellow here might be exactly what we need." Sarah had approached Atlas's training differently now, armed with the knowledge from the maps and journals. Instead of trying to make him adapt to a modern working style, she began to teach him the old ways. The methodology detailed in her grandfather's notes was fascinating. It wasn't about commanding the horse. but about creating a partnership based on mutual understanding of the task. "See how he moves," old Pete observed one morning, watching, as Sarah worked with Atlas near the well. "He's not just following commands, he's thinking through each step." The giant horse had developed a particular way of approaching the well mechanism, carefully examining each part before engaging with it. His methodical nature, once seen as stubbornness, now revealed itself as deep intelligence. The physical restoration of the well system became a community project. Farmers who had been on the verge of leaving the valley found new purpose in the work. Children were enlisted to clean and catalog equipment parts. Even the local school teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, incorporated the project into her lessons, teaching the students about the valley's history and the principles of sustainable water management. But the heart of the operation was Atlas. Sarah discovered that his previous refusal to work had actually been a refusal to work blindly. When introduced to the well mechanism properly, with patience and clear purpose, he showed an almost uncanny ability to understand what was needed. His size and strength were impressive, but it was his ability to maintain a steady, measured pace that proved invaluable. "It's like he can feel the water," Tommy observed one afternoon, watching Atlas work with the preliminary testing mechanism. The horse would adjust his pulling strength without being asked, responding to subtle changes in the resistance that even the adults couldn't detect. Sarah remembered her grandfather's notes about how the best well horses could sense the flow of the underground streams. The work wasn't without its challenges. The first attempt to clear the main well shaft revealed decades of accumulated debris. The old equipment, though built to last, required careful restoration. There were moments of frustration when modern tools proved inadequate for ancient tasks, and times when the enormity of what they were attempting seemed overwhelming. But Atlas remained their steady center. His calm presence and unwavering focus helped maintain morale during setbacks. When the first test of the restored mechanism failed, it was the horse's patient willingness to try again that kept everyone going. His intelligence showed in unexpected ways. He would often stop and wait during critical operations, somehow sensing when something needed adjustment before the humans noticed the problem. May spent hours translating the Chinese annotations in the margins of the maps, revealing crucial details about how the lunar cycles affected the water flow. These observations, combined with Atlas's sensitivity to the underground currents, helped them understand why the old system had worked so harmoniously with nature's rhythms. The community's involvement brought unexpected benefits. Old rivalries were forgotten as people worked together. Knowledge that had been scattered among different families was shared and pieced together. The project became about more than just accessing water. It became about preserving and honoring the wisdom of those who had come before them. Sarah found herself learning as much from Atlas as she was teaching him. His methodical approach to problems, his patience in working through difficulties, and his ability to adapt to changing situations became a model for the entire operation. The horse that had been dismissed as useless was teaching them all valuable lessons about the importance of understanding over force, of patience over haste. As the well system slowly took shape, Sarah realized that they weren't just reconstructing a piece of machinery, they were rebuilding the heart of their community. And at the center of it all was Atlas, the horse who had needed someone to understand him before he could help them understand what had been lost and what could still be saved. The first successful water test came on a quiet Sunday morning. Sarah had been working with Atlas since dawn, fine-tuning their rhythm with the restored mechanism. The giant horse had developed an almost musical cadence to his movements, each step precisely timed to the system's needs. The small crowd that had gathered held their breath as Atlas began his steady circuit, the ancient gears creaking to life beneath his power. At first, nothing happened. Then, from deep within the earth came a sound that no one in Millbrook Valley had heard in years, the gurgle of rising water. It wasn't much, just a trickle really, but it was clean, cold, and sweet. More importantly, it came from depths that modern pumps couldn't reach, proving that the underground aquifers were still viable. The success, modest though it was, transformed the atmosphere in the valley. People who had been quietly planning their departure began to reconsider. The local diner, which had been opening only 3 days a week, returned to its regular schedule as workers gathered there to discuss the project. Even the weather seemed to respond, with clouds gathering more frequently over the valley, as if the stirring of the deep waters had awakened something in the sky itself. Atlas's reputation underwent its own transformation. The useless horse became a local celebrity of sorts. Children would stop by the Chen farm after school, hoping to watch him work. They were fascinated by the way he would pause in his circuit, sometimes, head cocked, listening to something only he could hear in the deep well shaft. Tommy started keeping a journal of Atlas's behaviors, noting how the horse's reactions often predicted changes in the water flow hours before they became apparent to human observers. Sarah discovered that Atlas's influence extended far beyond the well project. His methodical approach to problems had become a model for other aspects of village life. When the town council met to discuss water management, they found themselves asking, what would Atlas do? Meaning, what was the patient, thoughtful approach to the problem? The horse's presence had a particularly profound effect on the village's children. Ms. Rodriguez incorporated regular visits to the well site into her curriculum, teaching physics through the mechanics of the pulley system, history through the story of the valley's development, and environmental science through the study of the aquifers. But perhaps most importantly, Atlas taught them about the value of being different. He doesn't do things like other horses, Tommy explained to his classmates one day. But that's what makes him special. He makes us see things in new ways. The boy's own confidence had grown through his friendship with Atlas. His physical challenges seemed less important when he was working with the gentle giant, sharing his observations with the adults who had learned to value his keen eye and quick mind. May noticed changes in Sarah too. Her daughter stood taller now, spoke with more authority. The weight of the family legacy no longer seemed to burden her shoulders. Instead, she had found her own way of honoring it, blending her grandfather's wisdom with her own insights. The Chen farm was becoming known not just for its well project, but for its approach to working with animals, an approach that emphasized understanding over dominance, patience over force. The success with the main well led to explorations of other sites marked on the old maps. Each one presented its own challenges, but Atlas approached them all with the same thoughtful dedication. He seemed to understand that each well was different, requiring its own rhythm, its own timing. Sarah marveled at how he would adjust his pace for each site, sometimes working in short, powerful bursts, other times maintaining a slow, steady pull for hours. Community members began bringing their own horses to the Chen farm, hoping to learn from Atlas's example. Sarah found herself sharing not just her grandfather's techniques, but the new understanding she had gained through working with Atlas. It's not about making them work, she would explain. It's about helping them find their purpose. The valley itself seemed to be healing. The first well's success had allowed them to begin restoring small sections of farmland. Where Atlas worked, green patches began to appear in the dusty fields. Birds returned, drawn by the stirring of life in the soil. Old Pete swore he could smell the change in the air, not just the presence of water, but the return of hope. Even the skeptics who had criticized Sarah's decision to buy Atlas had to admit that something remarkable was happening. The horse that had been deemed worthless had become the key to unlocking not just the valley's hidden water, but its hidden potential. His presence had reminded them of something their modern lives had made them forget, that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in power, but in patience. Not in speed, but in understanding. As autumn approached, bringing with it the promise of seasonal rains, Sarah often found herself watching Atlas in the evening light. The great horse would stand at the highest point of the Chen farm, his black coat gleaming, surveying the valley as if taking pride in the changes he had helped bring about. In these moments, Sarah understood that they had discovered something far more valuable than just a way to access deep water. They had rediscovered the power of community, the importance of legacy, and the truth that every being, no matter how misunderstood, has the potential to change the world around them. The proposal came from the County Water Board on a crisp autumn morning. Word of Millbrook Valley's success with the Deep Well project had spread beyond the community, attracting attention from neighboring towns and official agencies. The board members arrived in their polished cars, suits dusty from the drive down, the valley's dirt roads, carrying folders filled with data about the region's escalating water crisis. Their offer was both thrilling and terrifying. If the Chen farm could prove that their horse-drawn well system could successfully tap into the major aquifer that ran beneath the valley's northern ridge, the county would fund the restoration of the entire historical well network. It would mean water security not just for Millbrook Valley, but for the entire region. The catch? They had just 1 month to demonstrate results before the board's annual budget meeting. The northern ridge well was different from anything they'd attempted so far. According to the old maps, it was the deepest in the valley, dug by the original settlers who had somehow known about the massive underground river that flowed far below the surface. The well shaft had been sealed for 40 years, and no modern equipment had ever successfully reached its water. "It's too risky," May argued during the family council that evening. "The equipment could fail, Atlas could get hurt, we could lose everything we've worked for." Her concerns weren't unfounded. The northern well would require Atlas to work harder than ever before, pulling against pressures and depths they hadn't yet encountered. The town hall meeting that followed was intense. Some, like old Pete, supported taking the chance. This valley was built on brave gambles, he reminded everyone. Every settler who dug those first wells was betting their life on finding water. Others feared that failure would destroy not just their hopes but their reputation, making it even harder for the valley to recover. Sarah found herself in the barn that night, seeking wisdom in her grandfather's journals. Atlas watched her from his stool, his intelligent eyes following her pacing. The entry she found was from the year of the Great Drought, when Li Wei had faced his own impossible choice. "In matters of water and hope," he had written, "the safe path is not always the right one. Sometimes we must risk everything to save anything." The decision wasn't just about water rights or funding. It was about proving that their way of working with the land, this partnership between human, horse, and nature, could offer solutions that modern technology alone couldn't provide. It was about showing that sometimes moving forward meant looking back, learning from the wisdom of the past. Atlas himself seemed to sense the weight of the moment. When Sarah approached his stall, he pressed his massive head against her shoulder, in a gesture that had become his way of showing support. His calmness steadied her, reminding her of how far they'd come from those first uncertain days. "What do you think, old friend?" she asked him softly. "Are we ready for this?" Atlas's response was to walk deliberately to his stall door, waiting, with quiet confidence, to be let out. Even after all this time, his ability to understand crucial moments still amazed her. The technical challenges were daunting. The Northern Wells mechanism was larger and more complex than anything they'd worked with before. Mr. Henderson spent days researching the old blueprints, trying to understand how the original system had functioned. The depth meant that Atlas would need to maintain perfect rhythm and timing for much longer periods than usual. Tommy, who had become their unofficial record keeper, brought something interesting to their attention. His research into local weather patterns showed that the upcoming month, their window of opportunity, historically had the strongest underground water flow of the year. "It's like the old-timers knew exactly when to dig these wells," he observed. They worked with nature's schedule. The preparation became a valley-wide effort. Farmers offered their strongest equipment for reinforcing the well shaft. The local metalworker worked overtime to forge specialized parts they couldn't salvage. The school organized volunteers to help with the endless smaller tasks that needed doing. Everyone understood that this wasn't just about the Chen farm anymore. It was about the future of their entire community. Sarah spent hours with Atlas, gradually introducing him to the components of the larger mechanism. His methodical nature proved invaluable as they worked through each new challenge. He would often stop and study new equipment pieces, seeming to analyze how they fit into the larger system. His ability to adapt his tremendous strength to delicate tasks continued to amaze everyone who watched him work. The decision was made not in the town hall or the family kitchen, but in the quiet of dawn, as Sarah and Atlas stood together looking out over the valley. The first light revealed patches of green where their earlier work had begun to heal the land. In the distance, the northern ridge stood like a challenge against the sky. The choice felt both terrifying and inevitable, like all great moments that change not just lives but legacies. "We'll do it," Sarah announced at the emergency town council meeting that evening. The words carried the weight of not just her decision, but Atlas's quiet confidence, her grandfather's wisdom, and the collective hopes of a community that had rediscovered its spirit. As she spoke, she felt the truth of what they had all come to understand. Sometimes the biggest dreams require us to believe not just in ourselves, but in each other. The next 4 weeks transformed the Chen farm into a hub of constant activity. Dawn would find Sarah already at work with Atlas, their training sessions growing longer and more intensive each day. The northern well presented challenges, unlike anything they'd faced before. The depth meant that the pull on the mechanism would be dramatically stronger, requiring Atlas to maintain his strength over much longer periods. Sarah discovered that working with the enhanced mechanism was like learning a new language. The larger gears created different rhythms. The deeper shaft produced new sounds and vibrations. Atlas, with his extraordinary sensitivity, picked up on these changes immediately. He would often stop during their practice sessions, head cocked, listening to the subtle variations in the machinery's song. "He's not just pulling blindly," old Pete observed one morning, watching Atlas adjust his stance minutely between steps. "He's reading the well, same way his ancestors did." The old farmer had taken to arriving early each day, sharing stories of how his grandfather's horses had worked these same fields. His presence became a bridge between past and present, helping them understand the wisdom built into the old systems. The pressure of the deadline weighed heavily on everyone. Bodidiao. Officials made regular visits, their clipboards and questioning glances adding to the stress. They weren't just testing the well system. They were testing a way of life, a belief that sometimes the old ways could offer solutions that modern technology couldn't match. May threw herself into translating more of the Chinese annotations in the old journals, revealing crucial details about how the northern well had originally been operated. "Your grandfather wrote that this well was different," she told Sarah one evening. "He said it was like a dragon, powerful but temperamental. The horse and handler had to work as one, or it would defeat them both." The technical preparations were equally intense. Mr. Henderson practically lived in his workshop, fine-tuning each component of the mechanism. The system required perfect balance. Too much resistance, and even Atlas's tremendous strength wouldn't be enough. Too little. And they'd risk losing control of the deep water's pressure. Every piece had to be precisely calibrated, tested, and often redesigned. Tommy's contributions proved invaluable. His careful observations of Atlas's behavior patterns helped them understand how the horse processed new challenges. "He always takes 3 steps back before attempting something difficult," the boy noted in his journal. "It's like he's giving himself room to think." These insights helped Sarah adjust their training approach, allowing Atlas the time he needed to analyze each new aspect of the work. The physical demands on Atlas were significant. Sarah worked closely with the local veterinarian to monitor his condition, carefully balancing the need for intensive training with proper rest and recovery. The giant horse's dedication never wavered, but Sarah could see the toll the work was taking. Each evening she would spend hours cooling his legs and massaging his muscles, their quiet time together becoming a ritual of mutual support. Weather became an obsession. The success of the operation depended partly on the condition of the soil around the well shaft. Too dry, and the ground might crumble. Too wet, and the footing would be dangerous. They needed perfect conditions, and as the deadline approached, everyone in the valley found themselves watching the sky with increasing anxiety. The community's support manifested in countless ways. Farmers adjusted their schedules to help with the preparations. The local diner sent over meals to the workers. Children created a hand-drawn calendar to count down the days, decorating it with pictures of Atlas. Even the skeptics who had initially opposed the project found ways to contribute, their doubts gradually giving way to cautious hope. Sarah's own doubts surfaced most strongly in the quiet hours before dawn, when the enormity of what they were attempting would hit her full force. During these moments, she would often find herself in Atlas's stall, drawing strength from his steady presence. The horse seemed to understand her anxiety, offering quiet companionship that helped settle her racing thoughts. The pressure reached a crescendo in the final week before the demonstration. A minor equipment failure sent everyone into a panic. Atlas, sensing the tension, became unusually restless. It was Tommy who helped restore calm, reading aloud from his observation journal until both horse and humans remembered their purpose. Atlas has never failed when we trusted him, the boy reminded them. Maybe we need to trust ourselves the same way. His simple wisdom cut through the stress, helping everyone refocus on what they had learned over the months. That success came not from forcing solutions, but from finding the right rhythm, the right balance. The night before the demonstration, Sarah sat in the barn with her grandfather's journals spread around her. Atlas dozed in his stall, his breathing deep and steady. The past months had changed them both. The uncertain woman and the unwanted horse had found their strength in each other, in their community, and in the challenge that had seemed impossible. Tomorrow would test everything they had learned, everything they believed about the power of understanding over force, of patience over haste. As Sarah closed the journals and prepared to face whatever the next day would bring, she felt a deep sense of peace. Win or lose, they had already proven something invaluable, that sometimes the things we need most are the things we nearly throw away. The morning of the demonstration dawned clear and cool, with just enough moisture in the air to keep the dust down. County officials began arriving before sunrise, their vehicles creating a strange parade along the usually quiet dirt road to the northern well site. Sarah had been up for hours already, going through the final preparations with Atlas, both of them finding calm in their familiar routine. The northern well site had been transformed. The restored mechanism stood like an ancient sentinel against the sky, its freshly oiled gears catching the early morning light. The gathered crowd created an amphitheater of tension. County officials with their clipboards and cameras, local farmers trying to hide their anxiety behind stoic expressions, children perched on fence posts for a better view. Even those who had left the valley had returned to witness this moment. Atlas stood quietly in his preparation area, his freshly groomed coat gleaming black in the morning sun. Sarah noticed how he kept his eyes on the well mechanism, his ears moving constantly, already tuning into its rhythm. This was what set him apart, his ability to understand not just what was asked of him, but why it mattered. The underground water levels are optimal, Tommy announced from his monitoring station, where he'd been tracking the measurements all morning, just like the old maps predicted. He sat surrounded by graphs and charts, his crutches propped nearby, looking every bit the scientist his careful observations had made him. The head of the county water board stepped forward, his crisp suit incongruous against the rustic setting. Ms. Chen, we'll need to see the well produce a sustainable flow for at least 4 hours, with consistent pressure that meets our minimum requirements. He gestured to the monitoring equipment his team had installed. Everything will be measured and recorded. Sarah nodded, then turned to Atlas. In that moment, all the doubts, all the preparations, all the hopes of the community seemed to fade away. What remained was simply this: a woman, a horse, and a challenge that would test everything they believed about each other. The first hour was crucial. Atlas settled into the rhythm they'd practiced, his powerful shoulders moving with deliberate precision. The mechanism responded to his steady pace, its ancient gears turning with increasing confidence. Sarah watched his every move, reading the subtle signs in his body language that told her how the system was responding. The first sign of water brought a collective intake of breath from the crowd. It wasn't just seepage or a trickle. It was a steady flow of clear, cold water from deep within the earth. The county officials huddled around their instruments, muttering and making notes. But Atlas's real test came in the second hour. Sarah felt the change before she saw it. A slight alteration in the resistance of the mechanism. Underground water. Patterns were shifting, creating new pressures. This was what they'd trained for, what set their approach apart from mechanical solutions. Atlas needed to adapt his rhythm without losing momentum. The horse's response was masterful. Without breaking stride, he adjusted his pulling angle slightly, compensating for the changed resistance. Sarah saw old Pete nodding in approval. This was exactly how the well horses of the past had worked, reading and responding to the water's subtle messages. The third hour brought a challenge none of them had anticipated. A shift in the underground water flow created a sudden surge of pressure that rattled the entire mechanism. Several county officials stepped back in alarm. This was the kind of situation that had defeated mechanical pumps in the past. Atlas paused for 3 beats, his thinking rhythm, as Tommy called it. Then, with careful deliberation, he adjusted both his pace and his position. The mechanism stabilized, finding a new harmony with the water's flow. Sarah heard murmurs of appreciation from the crowd. Even the skeptical officials looked impressed. As they entered the final hour, the strain began to show. Atlas's coat was dark with sweat, his breathing heavy, but controlled. Sarah watched him carefully for signs of fatigue. But there was something else in his bearing, a pride, a determination that seemed to grow stronger with each step. He wasn't just performing a task, he was proving something about himself, about all of them. The water continued to flow, clear and strong. The county's measurements showed consistent pressure, even better results than they'd required. But the numbers didn't capture the real achievement, the sight of a horse and handler working in perfect unity, demonstrating an approach to the land that was both ancient and revolutionary. In the final minutes, Atlas seemed to find new energy. His pace remained as steady as it had been in the first hour, his focus unwavering. When the head official finally raised his hand to signal the end of the test, the horse completed one more full circuit before coming to a precise stop. The silence that followed was profound. The only sound was the continued flow of water, its music filling the valley air. Sarah moved to Atlas's side, feeling the heat radiating from his body, the trembling of his muscles, but also the steadiness of his spirit. He had done more than prove himself. He had proven that sometimes the most powerful solutions come not from dominating nature, but from working in harmony with it. The head official cleared his throat. "Ms. Chen," he began, looking from his clipboard to the still flowing. "Well, I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like this." The wonder in his voice spoke volumes. This wasn't just about water rights anymore. They had demonstrated something that challenged the very way people thought about progress. The celebration that erupted in Millbrook Valley that evening was unlike anything the community had seen in years. The town hall, dusty from disuse, was hastily opened and decorated. Tables groaned under the weight of potluck dishes, and the old wooden dance floor creaked with the steps of celebrating farmers. The county water board's unanimous approval had come with more than just funding. It had brought validation to a vision that had once seemed impossible. But the real celebration was happening at the Chen farm. Atlas stood in his paddock, freshly bathed and wrapped in his best blanket, accepting congratulations from a steady stream of visitors. Children brought him carrots and apples, while adults who had once dismissed him as worthless now approached, with respect bordering on reverence. The giant horse accepted it all with his characteristic quiet dignity, though Sarah noticed how his ears pricked forward every time Tommy's voice rose above the crowd. "Your grandfather would be proud," May told Sarah softly, as they watched Atlas graciously accept attention from yet another group of admirers. "Not just of what you've accomplished, but of how you did it." She held out a newly translated page from Leeway's journals. "He wrote about a day like this, you know. Not about the well exactly, but about what it means when people remember who they are." The county officials had left with more than just data and measurements. They carried with them stories of a horse that could read underground water flows, of a community that had found strength in its roots, of a young woman who had seen value where others saw only liability. Already there was talk of studying the Chen Farm's methods, of documenting this unique partnership between human, horse, and land. Mr. Thompson, who had extended credit to Sarah in her darkest hour, stood near the paddock fence with tears in his eyes. "I've been in this valley 60 years, he said to anyone who would listen, "and I've never seen anything like what that horse did today. It wasn't just the water. It was like he was reminding us of something we'd forgotten." The technical achievement was significant enough. The northern well had produced water at depths and pressures that modern pumps couldn't match, and done it with a sustainability that amazed the county engineers. But the greater victory lay in what it represented. Atlas hadn't just helped them reach water. He had helped them reconnect with a wisdom that had nearly been lost. Old Pete gathered the children around, his voice carrying years of valley history. "Used to be, every farm had horses like Atlas," he told them. "Not as big, maybe, and probably not as smart, but they understood the land in a way machines never could. They worked with it, not just on it." The children listened intently, their eyes moving between the old farmer and the majestic horse, absorbing a lesson about harmony that went beyond mere words. Sarah found herself drawn to the well site as evening approached. The mechanism stood silent now, but the water still flowed, its steady music a promise of renewal. Atlas noticed her departure and carefully extracted himself from his admirers, following her with measured steps that showed his lingering fatigue from the day's work. Together, they stood in the gathering dusk, horse and handler, watching the water catch the last rays of sunlight. Sarah remembered the auction where she'd first seen Atlas, remembered how everyone else had seen a broken, worthless animal. The journey from that moment to this one hadn't just been about proving them wrong. It had been about discovering a different way of measuring value. Tommy joined them, his observation journal clutched proudly in his hands. The boy who had once been defined by his physical limitations was now known throughout the valley as their most astute scientific mind. "I've been calculating," he announced, spreading his notes on a nearby fence rail. "Based on the water pressure and flow rates, Atlas's method is actually more efficient than any mechanical pump ever used in the valley." The implications of their success rippled outward like waves in a pond. Other communities began reaching out, asking about the Chen Farm's methods. Agricultural schools requested permission to study their approach. But perhaps most significantly, families that had been planning to leave the valley began to reconsider. The sight of green beginning to return to the fields, of water flowing from the deep wells, rekindled hope that had nearly been extinguished. May found Sarah later that night, after most of the celebration had died down. She carried a small wooden box Sarah had never seen before. "Your grandfather left this for the person who would understand what the valley really needed," she explained. Inside was an old brass key, its surface etched with Chinese characters. He always said the valley's salvation wouldn't come from new inventions, but from remembering old truths. The key, it turned out, opened a hidden compartment in Leeway's desk, containing detailed plans for restoring not just the wells, but the entire valley's traditional water management system. It was a legacy, waiting for the right moment, the right person, and the right partner to bring it to life. As the stars emerged above the valley, Sarah sat in Atlas's paddock, the box of plans in her lap. The giant horse stood nearby, his presence as reassuring as ever. They had done more than save a valley. They had proven that progress doesn't always mean abandoning the past. Sometimes it means finding the wisdom hidden in what others have, forgotten or discarded. The water's song drifted up from the well, a melody of promise and possibility. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to share what they had learned. But for now, in the quiet of a victory earned through patience, understanding, and trust, Sarah simply sat with her extraordinary partner, grateful for the twist of fate that had brought them together and the courage they had found in each other. 1 year after the Northern Well test, Millbrook Valley had transformed in ways that even the most optimistic residents hadn't imagined possible. The network of restored wells, each operated with the same horse-drawn methods that Atlas had pioneered, created a sustainable water system that brought life back to the parched earth. But the changes went far deeper than just the return of water. To the valley, the Chen farm had become a center of learning, drawing visitors from across the country and beyond. Farmers, engineers, and environmental scientists came to study their methods, often arriving with skepticism but leaving with a new understanding of how traditional wisdom could address modern challenges. Sarah found herself teaching what Atlas had taught her, that sometimes the most powerful solutions come from listening to the land and working in harmony with its rhythms. Atlas, now a legend in his own right, had unknowingly started a revolution in sustainable water management. His methodical approach to well operation had been documented and studied, revealing principles that no one had previously considered. The combination of horsepower and natural water flow created a system that was not only more efficient than mechanical pumps, but also more responsive to environmental changes. Tommy's careful observations had evolved into a formal research project, supported by a major agricultural university. His documentation of Atlas's ability to read and respond to underground water patterns had opened new avenues of study in animal intelligence and environmental interaction. The boy who once watched from the fence had become a respected authority on traditional well systems, his physical challenges forgotten in the light of his intellectual contributions. The valley itself bloomed with renewed purpose. Fields that had lain dormant for years now grew crops again, planned and planted according to the wisdom found in Li Wei's restored journals. The Chinese agricultural techniques he had documented, combined with modern understanding, created a hybrid approach that proved remarkably resilient to changing climate conditions. Sarah stood at her grandfather's favorite spot on the farm, watching Atlas work with a young draft horse they had recently brought in. The giant black horse had taken on a new role as mentor, showing the same patience with his equine student that Sarah had once shown him. His methodical nature, once seen as stubbornness, was now recognized as one of his greatest teaching assets. "He's teaching them more than just well work," old Pete observed, coming to stand beside her. "He's teaching them how to think." The old farmer had become the valley's unofficial historian, sharing stories of the past with a new generation that now understood their value. His tales of the old well horses had been recorded and archived, preserving knowledge that had nearly been lost. May had fully embraced her role as keeper of both Chinese and American agricultural traditions. Her translations of Li Wei's journals had expanded into a broader project, documenting the valley's unique blend of cultural practices. "Your grandfather always said the valley needed both roots and wings," she told Sarah. "The roots of tradition and the wings of innovation." The community had grown stronger through their shared purpose. Regular gatherings at the town hall now featured discussions of water management alongside traditional celebrations. Children grew up understanding the delicate balance between human needs and natural resources, learning from both books and the living example of Atlas and his growing network of well-working horses. Mr. Thompson's store had become a hub for both traditional and modern farming supplies, its shelves reflecting the valley's unique approach to agriculture. The old ledger where he had once recorded Sarah's desperate credit line now showed a community thriving on its own terms, proving that success didn't always mean abandoning the old ways for the new. Atlas's story had spread far beyond Millbrook Valley. Children's books told the tale of the useless horse who saved a community. Agricultural journals published studies of his working methods. But perhaps most importantly, his example had inspired other communities to look at their own discarded resources with new eyes, to seek value in what others had overlooked. The northern well remained special, marking the place where everything had changed. Sarah often found herself there at dawn, watching the sun rise over the mechanism that Atlas had taught them to understand. The horse would join her, his presence as steady and reassuring as ever, both of them feeling the deep pulse of water flowing far below their feet. One morning, as they stood together watching the valley wake up, Sarah noticed something remarkable. Atlas's coat, once dull from neglect, now gleamed with health and purpose. But it was his eyes that showed the most striking change. The wariness that had once shadowed them had been replaced by a deep contentment, a knowledge of his place in the world. "You knew all along, didn't you?" she asked him softly. "You were just waiting for us to understand." Atlas nickered gently, pressing his head against her shoulder in the gesture that had become their shared language of trust and understanding. Looking out over the valley, Sarah could see the legacy they had built together. It wasn't just in the flowing wells or the greening fields. It was in the way people had learned to value what truly mattered, the wisdom of the past, the strength of community, and the extraordinary potential that lies within every being, waiting for someone to believe in it. The morning sun caught the water flowing from the well, creating momentary rainbows in the spray. Atlas watched them with his characteristic, thoughtful expression, his presence a reminder that sometimes the most powerful changes come not from forcing new paths, but from rediscovering old ones. Together, they had done more than save a valley. They had shown that hope, like water, can spring from the deepest and most unexpected places. Nourishing not Atlas's story had spread far beyond Millbrook Valley,